Hiya. So it's me again, and today I want to talk about what I think is one of the most overlooked systems in heroic servers. In my opinion, it's one of the best systems to interact with very early into the game because of how passively you can set it up and because of how much value it brings to your account when first starting out. I also think a lot of people tend to forget what you can really make with it and how versatile it can be all the way through even to the later parts of the game. That system is professions, or the place where you can craft anything that you need, really. Now, professions is mainly known for three items in particular, that being wealth acquisition potions, or WAP for short, and EXP accumulation potions, or EAP for short, and Meister rings. But believe it or not, you can actually get so much more utility out of the profession system, and I'm going to show you exactly how. So before I actually even get to the professions part of this video, I might as well talk about traits since it's slapped into the same menu and levels up as you create things using professions. And it's the first thing that opens up when you actually open up your professions menu. But don't get it twisted, traits are also very important because they give you buffs as you level them up. The two most important, in my opinion, is number one being Charm. If you get Charm to level 30, you can open up your pocket slot, which obviously can be used to get you more set effects and more free stats without really having to do anything for it. And the second one that's most important is Insight, which gives you Ignore Elemental Resist, which when you max this out actually gives you 2.5 final damage on pretty much anything that you hit boss-wise, which is very nice. But a lot of them can also be useful besides maybe Diligence, which doesn't really have an effect in heroic servers. So Ambition gives you Ignore enemy defense, which is obviously useful because IED is not really a stat that you want on your WC or your familiars. So getting IED in places where you don't really get them elsewhere is a good thing to have. The next one is Empathy, which is good for buff duration, which obviously works very well when it comes to using Angelic Buster Link, or if you're a class that actually scales off of buff duration. So if you're a dual blade or a Dark Knight, for example, leveling up your empathy can also be very useful. And then there's Willpower. And Willpower, I mean, if you're a Demon Avenger, it gives you HP, which is just more damage. But the status resistance can also be more useful. Now, granted, the scaling of status resistance falls off really hard because it's calculated logarithmically. But, of course, it is still something nice to have in case if you ever catch yourself in a bind where maybe you get stunned and you need to break out of it very quickly. So places like Gloom or Darknell, where this happens very often, this can be very, very useful. So overall, you can probably expect at least 3 to 4% final damage just by maxing out your traits. So definitely don't forget about traits. And if you're focusing on one character, you should be buying trait boost potions to max these out. Alright, so since it's presented to us in this order, I'm just going to go from left to right and cover them one by one. Now, I won't really cover herbalism or mining because they aren't really useful anymore, especially with the auto-harvesting system and Threads of Fate, which means that you can get resources without having to level these up, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of these two parts of the profession system. But the other three obviously still have their purposes and what they can be used for. Now, smithing is, I would say, the most situational out of the three, depending on what class you play. It can be either very useful or pretty useful at best. Now, smithing has one thing that every class can use, even in the endgame, and that is the Meister smithing buff. So when you get your smithing to the Meister level, You will unlock an ability in your beginner tab called Advanced Weapon Tempering, which gives you 5% crit damage for 40 minutes, which makes it one of the best buffs, if not the best buff in the game, because of how rare a stat crit damage really is. Now, in order to get access to that buff, you need A, Meistersmithing, and B, you need to craft 2 magic whetstones for every use of the advanced weapon tempering buff. Now, realistically, it's not a buff that you're going to be using all the time, because it is a relatively expensive buff, especially if you don't farm, because of the recipe that it actually takes to craft magic whetstones. Superior item crystals aren't too bad as long as you're getting items to 140, and you use Alchemy to dismantle them in Ardent Mill. Twisted Times you get from farming bosses and farming mobs, and Grand Spell Essences pretty much exclusively only come from farming. And Grand Spell Essences are pretty rare, which makes it really hard to justify using this buff all the time. You only use it in very, very min-maxy situations where you need to squeeze out as much damage as possible. Now, it's not to say that getting Meistersmithing isn't useful, but the Grand Spell Essences also do coincide with a lot of other recipes that can be useful in general, which makes it really hard to justify actually using this buff on repeat. But nevertheless, the smithing buff is here and it is useful at times. Now, depending on what class you play, there can be other uses for smithing. So, for example, if you play a class that uses projectiles, like Bowmaster or Marksman, creating titanium arrow for bow and crossbow can just get you an extra 9 attack. And considering that those classes don't really consume arrows anymore, you just need to craft these once and you pretty much permanently have 9 attack. Other uses for the smithing include shields. So if you're a class that uses shields like mages or shadower, for example, you can also craft offhand weapons like the Deimos Shadow Shield and the Deimos Sage Shield, which can be located in the sub-weapon area. I'll put the materials required to actually craft these shields on screen right now if you need them. But another thing is, if you are crazy enough to either play Mechanic or Evan, you can also create equipment for your dragon and your mechanic, or for your machine or robot, I guess, respectively, which is just extra stat. For mechanic you get a set effect, and then for Evan your equipment can just level up as you create them, which is just more stats for your character overall. Alrighty, on to accessory crafting. Now, accessory crafting, just like smithing, has a buff of its own when you create magic emerstones, but magic emerstones and the buff that comes from accessory crafting isn't as useful as the smithing buff, so realistically creating these isn't very useful. But I think accessory crafting in general is more useful and isn't really dependent on what class you play. There are 2 main items that you want to craft, and 2 items that I personally think can be situationally good depending on what you're looking for or what you can actually reasonably accomplish. Now, the first one that everybody obviously talks about because it is a good alternative to Kana's Treasure, where you don't really have to wait and you can farm it out. The first is Meister Rings. Now, Meister Rings are obviously useful because it's one of the best rings because you can star them up and you can get a lot of copies. So going for 22 and getting a lot of stats out of a Meister Ring isn't really too hard. Now, One thing that I think a lot of people forget to bring up about the accessory crafting is actually being able to craft Dominator pendants. Now, obviously, this is one of the best pendants in the game, just falling behind Daybreak and the Source of Suffering. But what makes this pendant so good and being able to craft it is that you need a lot of copies of these, especially when you need to transfer them into Superior Gollix pendants and the Source of Suffering eventually when you get into the late and end stages of the game. Now, the good thing about being able to craft Dominator pendants is that you can get this on characters that don't even have a lot of drop rate. So boss mules can also reasonably get their hands on Dominator pendants. And the reason why it's also so easy is because you only need level 10 accessory crafting, which you can pretty much reasonably do within a day. If you actually get your crafting done before reset, or if you have infinite revitalizers through events, or if you like to swipe your credit card for fun. Now, it pains me to see that a lot of people actually end up selling their primal essences and confusion fragments for a little bit of meso, because you could be turning these items into more Dominator pendants for your account, whether you actually need spares on your main, or if you want to create a Dominator pendant for a character that is just getting started. Having a Dominator pendant in the early game without needing the drop rate to actually get one is crazy value and can make you either very strong when just starting out, or makes your life a lot easier so that you don't have to worry about having to get a Dominator pendant drop from Arcarium. Now, the reason why the Dominator pendant I think is so relevant now is because of the amount of primal essences that you get from Chaos Tenebris, if you can solo it. And if you have a lot of mules that are running Arcarium, or if you have a lot of characters that are running Arcarium, getting confusion fragments is also very common. So scraping up the materials to make a Dominator pendant is actually not that taxing. If anything, the worst thing about this recipe is actually the pieces of time, because this is only dropped by some mobs, and I think Pink Bane, I could be mistaken, I'll put it up here if it's actually true or not, but you have to go out of your way to get the pieces of time. What? That was... Well, that was rude. They just kicked me out. Well, I got kicked out of the sauna for yapping a little too much, but the point I'm trying to make is that crafting Dominator pendants is basically like your pity system for Dominator pendants. So if you ever get unlucky and you aren't really seeing Dominator pendants from Arcarium, using the profession system to create Dominator pendants is a good way to get out of that bind and to get yourself more spares. Alright, so the first of the two situational items I would say is the shiny red Meister symbols. Now, if you are somebody who doesn't have immediate access to Hard Lucid and Hard Will to get Twilight Marks, this might be one of the most useful items in the game. Especially if you can't clear it, or if you can't get access to the face accessory very quickly. I personally feel like this is a better option than the Zakum face accessory for damage and drop gear. Damage in the early game because you can get it over 15 stars, and drop gear into the late game because getting a 20-star item, A, isn't too expensive, and B, can give you a lot of attack when farming in the higher level regions where you typically want to have a little bit more damage. Now, you will need to farm out the recipe for the shiny red symbols, not to be mistaken with the shiny red Meister symbols, which can take a bit of time, but in comparison to the time and effort that it takes to having to create a new face accessory if you need more damage when farming, I would say that this is a good middle ground between a Twilight Mark and the Zakum face accessory. Now, obviously, if you already have an account established and you can trade Hard Lucid and Hard Will for Twilight Marks, then this basically becomes irrelevant, because then you can start stacking up Twilight Mark spares early, which means that you can create one for drop gear and one for damage gear if you so prefer. Or, if you don't really want to do that, you can always create one of these for drop gear and then use the Twilight Marks strictly just for damage gear. Now, the last item that I'd actually recommend from Accessory Crafting is the purple pendants, specifically the purple bear, owl, wolf, and peacock pendants. Now, this shares a lot of similarities to the Red Meister face accessories, in the sense that it's a 130 item that you can get up fairly cheap, that can be a good replacement for 120 items or 120 and below items that you get in the early game. So for pendants specifically, I think this is a good replacement for Mechanators. Now, granted, this pendant is a little harder to recommend going for, mainly because Arcarium is a lot more accessible and Dominators are a lot more common. But in a world where you're struggling to get a Dominator and Superior Gollux, obviously you're waiting behind a time gate, you can craft purple pendants as a way to get your hands on a pendant that can go over 15, starting out for just a little bit of extra damage and pretty solid drop gear as you get into late and endgame. Now, once again, because Dominators are more common and superior pendants are a thing, it's harder to recommend this pendant because it is a lot more prone to being replaced, and there are a lot more copies of Dominators so that you can replace the pendant, but it is an option that you can make in the early game if you don't have the resources to make a Dominator pendant, or you're not getting a Dominator pendant, or if you can't really get your hands on a superior pendant yet. There is uses for this pendant, but it's not as universal, I would say, as the other 3 items previously mentioned. So let's talk about Alchemy, which is probably the best profession out of the 3. Even though it doesn't have a dedicated buff like Accessory Crafting and Smithing, Alchemy is still insanely useful and versatile. And the first reason for that, obviously, is the main thing that people will talk about. That is wealth acquisition potions and EXP accumulation potions. But for now, I'm going to focus on wealth acquisition potions because I think by far and away this is the most useful buff in the game. When you're early game and just getting started out, crafting WAPs is incredible because it gives you 20% drop rate, which can be used to get your meso bags early on, and gives you 20% meso. The interesting thing about wealth acquisition potions is that this is a multiplicative increase by 20%, unlike any other source in the game. So it takes your meso and increases it by 1.2x instead of adding 20%. So this takes all things into consideration, like Legion, gear, and other buffs like the Legion Wealth, and multiplies it by 1.2, which basically means that when using this potion, the amount of meso that you make increases by a massive amount. But it isn't even just the meso that makes this potion so good, it's the drop rate as well, because drop rate can be used to get items from certain bosses like Dominator pendants, like Superior Gollux items, pitched, ring boxes, you name it. This is the single best buff in the game for getting items that will make your character stronger. And you should be popping this pretty much at every chance that you can get, especially for the high value items that you need a lot of, like Dominator pendants, for example. Popping a small version of this potion just to get your hands on an extra Dominator pendant or to get your hands on an extra Superior Gollux item is definitely worth the cost of making these potions. Now, a resource that is pretty much just as useful as Meso and drops is XP, because as you level up, you get free damage through symbols, 6 job, you name it. And the XP accumulation potion is a buff that just gives you more XP. It can be used in tandem with the wealth acquisition potion, given that you've learned Alchemy, to give you more Meso and drop and more XP when farming. These two guys are two peas in a pod when farming and should always be used with each other. Now, obviously, XP accumulation potion is only good when farming, because farming is what gives you XP, but XP accumulation potions are still insanely useful at all parts of the game because it is just a free 10% XP. So now let's get into the actual buffs that you can use when bossing. Not just the buffs that give you more resources so that you can scale your account faster. Let's talk about the actual buffs. Now, the first buff that I personally want to talk about is the number one alternative, and basically the mirror image of the sparkling red star potion. And that is the boss rush boost potion and advanced boss rush boost potion. Pretty much does the same thing as the sparkling red star potion, but does not last as long. It also takes quite a bit of resources. The dusk essence in particular is relatively hard to get, but is easier now with auto harvesting. Same thing with the advanced boss rush boost potions. You need brilliant dusk essence, which is kind of annoying to get, but if you can actually make these potions, it is basically like a red star potion, which is good for all points in the game. It is a best in slot buff and is always useful. And since we're talking about Meister potions, I might as well talk about the penetrating boost potion and the advanced penetrating boost potion. Pretty much can be used in tandem with the boss rush boost potion, or it can be used with sparkling red star potions, and instead of giving 20 boss, it gives 20 IED. Pretty much has the same recipes as the boss rush boost potion, which makes it kind of demanding, but is probably one of the better options if you don't have your hands on the smithing buff. And is a good alternative to have, especially if you don't want to eat through as many grand spell essences, because these buffs from the smithing buff do definitely chew through your grand spell essences. So if you want a cheaper option, advanced penetrating boost potion is also a very solid option and can scale differently depending on what class you're playing. So classes with really low base IED like Adele or Cannon Master can make really good use of this potion. Now, my favorite that a lot of people really don't talk about is the legendary hero potion, or El Hero, not to be confused with the El Hero from Undertale. The legendary hero potion is another very good alternative to the penetrating potion and the smithing buff, as it gives you 30 attack. But one thing in particular that makes this potion so good is it is a buff that is extremely cheap, because it pretty much just uses juniper berry flower oil, which isn't really used for much besides one thing, which I'll cover in a few minutes. But another thing that makes this potion so good is the fact that it lasts for 2 hours, which is the same duration as a sparkling red star potion. I really like to use this potion as like a filler potion to like lab and test out bosses when I really want to try simulating my damage in a real run and not in practice mode. The legendary hero potion to me is the next best option to the smithing buff. Now obviously the penetrating potion is better than the legendary hero, but I like the legendary hero for the duration and for how cheap you can actually make these potions. Very useful potions. Definitely look into these. You do have to farm out the recipe, which is kind of annoying. Usually takes about 10 to 20 minutes per recipe for it to actually drop if you're on a relatively high drop rate. But if you do get these recipes, make sure that you have a lot of juniper berry flower oil before making these potions so that you can just make a bunch and just forget about it, and now you have a permanent resource, permanent extra buff that you have on your account at all points in time. Now, the last potion that I want to talk about in particular is the Advanced Stat Potion X. Now, this is also one of the best potions to make, strictly just because it can stack with all other buffs that you can apply. This includes consumable attack buffs, your red star potion, your penetrating potion, your smithing buff. It can stack with all potions in the game. And when you get the advanced version of this potion, it lasts 30 minutes and gives you 30 stats. This also scales with percentages, so do not underestimate how much damage this buff actually gives you. Now, you can craft the normal versions of the potion, but they do only last for 15 minutes. So I highly suggest taking the time to actually farm out the recipe for the advanced version of the potion. It does also consume a little bit more resources. You do need lithium to craft these potions, but the double duration is very worth it, especially when speaking in the context of bosses and how bosses are 30 minutes long instead of 15 or even less than that. Now, do note that these recipes drop from different monsters depending on what stat that you're actually looking for. And I do think that this potion is somewhat min-maxy, so it's not the end of the world if you don't run a boss without this buff. So I would say to only farm out this recipe if this is a main or if a character that you're actively progressing to C10 and beyond, because this will definitely help make your clears faster to at least some degree. Okay, and the last thing on the chopping block for alchemy, which I personally think makes it very useful, is the herb and mineral bags, as well as the coin purses. Now, if you don't want to spend on etc. inventory slots, at least in the early game, or if you don't want to spend on the 20 slot bags when it comes to herbalism and mining, you can just craft them if you hit alchemy. Now, personally, I feel like this is really good for mules, or really good for anybody if you just don't want to spend the money. There is use cases for this. Now, the Dusk Essence obviously makes it a little expensive, but obviously with auto harvesting, it can be not too bad, considering that there is a consistent way to get essences now. But in my opinion, the big winner is the coin purses. Especially considering that we don't know what systems are coming out in the future, and considering that coin purses really don't exist in events anymore, coin purses are a great way to save on inventory slots, like Monster Park coins, Magnus coins, a whole bunch of other coins, like home coins, and it keeps it very organized. You can find all your coins on one spot, so you don't have to like track them or lock them in your inventory and put them somewhere weird. You can just craft coin purses and be on your merry way. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before wrapping this up is actually the auto harvesting system. I think this system is interesting for one reason, mainly because it can get you into harvesting a lot earlier than you think, because the efficiency in which you actually harvest items through the system is not based on your mining and herbalism level. Which means that the moment you start the system, you can get to the expert harvesting system or expert harvesting farm right away. And as long as you kill daily bosses, which you'll do, clear Monster Park, which you'll do, and defeat enemies near your level, which you'll do, will increase the efficiency at which you actually harvest these items. Realistically, the items aren't the most important for this particular system. It's mostly the coins and the shop. because the shop can basically let you select anything that you want, whether it be herbs, whether it be minerals, or whether it be essences, which are all very key items when it comes to any sort of profession related activities. And considering that you don't really have to put much thought and effort into this, is something that makes this really nice for players that are just getting started. And even though this harvesting system does get you resources relatively slowly, the fact that you can get it up and running without much effort and much maintenance is a big benefit over Threads of Fate. Now, am I saying that Threads of Fate is not useful? No, Threads of Fate is still going to be a staple in terms of how you get your minerals and herbs, at least for now, in Maple, but I think this is a good way to get started, at least in the early game, to get a lot of these key items up and running as fast as possible without having to put much effort of going through the quest line, the Mushroom Shrine quest line, and without having to babysit your 3 characters and give them gifts and all that. And that'll pretty much be it for this video. I mostly wanted to use this video as a way to remind people of the versatility that actually exists in the profession system and what you can really make out of the profession system. A lot of people think that profession system is only used for WAPs or for Meister rings, but you can actually get a lot more value if you just hold on to the resources that passively drop from killing mobs or killing bosses. If you guys want to see me make a guide on Threads of Fate or anything else that is profession related, please leave a like down below. I will definitely take it into consideration. But for now, that'll be it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, and sub, or I will literally eat your mesos faster than Star Forcing does. Much love, and peace out.